Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that's something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and make sure that you switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will notify you every single time that I post. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about the case of the Ipswich serial killer, which is also known as the Suffolk Strangler case. Surprisingly, I had never actually heard of this case until someone suggested it to me through my case request form a couple of weeks ago, which is always linked in my description box, by the way, if anyone else wants to suggest a case. But yeah, this case was suggested to me and I started looking into it and I decided that I wanted to cover it this week. But before we get into this case, I do just want to say a huge thank you to Small Town Murders for sponsoring this video. Small Town Murders is this incredible new mobile puzzle game that has honestly become one of my favourite games ever to play. It was created by the makers of Angry Birds and it allows you to put your detective skills to the test because you become the investigator. In Small Town Murders, you investigate crime scenes and solve murder mystery cases and puzzle games. There are hundreds of new levels to choose from and you get to uncover evidence, unlock clues and interrogate a cast of quirky characters including Nora Mystery and Deputy Shanahan, all from the comfort of your own home. I really love playing Small Town Murders in the evening after I've finished doing work or when I'm taking a break from doing work, because even though it is a mystery game, it's not super difficult, so it's a good game to play when you are trying to wind down, or it would be really fun to play with family and friends, I think, because you can see who can solve the mystery first. So if you are looking for a challenge, make sure you check out Small Town Murders. You can download it right now from the link in the description box. They are actually doing a special promotion at the moment where every new user receives in-game boosters to help you solve those extra tricky puzzles, so now is the perfect time to download it. Like I said, the link to the game will be top line of the description box. Once again, I just want to say a huge thank you to Small Town Murders for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case of the Ipswich serial murders. So our case today happened in the year 2006 in Ipswich, which is a town in Suffolk in England. It was the 30th of October 2006 when a young woman named Tanya Nicholl just suddenly disappeared without a trace. Now, Tanya was 19 years old at the time of her disappearance and she grew up on an estate on the outskirts of Ipswich. Her mother was called Kerry and her father was named Jim, and Tanya also had a younger brother as well. But at 16 years old, Tanya left her family home and she decided to go and live in a hostel, and soon after she left, she began using drugs such as heroin and she quickly developed a drug addiction. And at the time of this case taking place in October of 2006, when she was 19 years old, Tanya was actually working as a sex worker in the red light district area of Ipswich. And around that time, there was actually a high number of sex workers in the Ipswich area, and Tanya was one of them. Now, one source said that Tanya had only been doing sex work for a couple of weeks, whereas another said that she had been doing it for over a year. So I don't really know what's true there, but regardless, the reason she was doing this job was because of her addiction to drugs. The drugs obviously cost her a lot of money and this was her way of paying for it. Although her family actually had no idea that she was doing this, that this was how she was getting her money, she lied to them and told them that she was working in a bar. But on the evening of the 30th of October 2006, Tanya left her home and she went straight to work at the red light district. She would stand by the side of the road and wait to be approached by clients, and in most cases she would agree to go off with them. But on this particular day, Tanya never returned home. She just disappeared without a trace, and she was never seen alive again. And I think when Tanya didn't return home, her family, particularly her mother Kerry, was immediately concerned, and so not long after she disappeared, Tanya was reported as missing to the police. The police soon discovered that the night Tanya went missing, she was working in the red light district area of Ipswich, and so straight away her disappearance was taken very seriously because, of course, sex workers expose themselves to danger every single night. Who knows what kind of person is lurking the streets. So the search for 19-year-old Tanya Nicholl began immediately, although it was very difficult for the police because they didn't have anything to go on, really. They had a look through Tanya's phone records and discovered that there had been no activity on her phone since around the time that she went missing, and they also had a look through CCTV footage in the area, including the footage from local buses that Tanya may have gotten that night, the night that she went missing. But she wasn't spotted on any of them, any of these buses, so they really struggled to put together Tanya's movements from that night. Eventually, the police turned to the public and they launched an appeal with Tanya's mother, Kerry. They were hoping that someone would come forward with information regarding Tanya's whereabouts, but they received little leads. No one seemed to really know anything. It literally was like Tanya had just disappeared off the face of the earth. But then, just over 2 weeks after Tanya disappeared, the police were faced with the disappearance of another young woman who seemed to have gone missing under very similar circumstances. The second woman to disappear in Ipswich was 25-year-old Gemma Adams, and she went missing on the evening of the 14th of November 2006. Gemma, like Tanya, also had an addiction to drugs, which began about a year after she left school when she was 17 years old, and she would also fund this addiction through sex work, a job that she had been doing for roughly 2 years. And that's exactly what she had been doing on the 14th of November. She was out working in the red light district. However, after this night, she was never seen again. Gemma's boyfriend John started to get concerned when Gemma just suddenly stopped replying to his text messages. This was an immediate red flag for him because Gemma, much like Tanya Nicholl, always kept in contact with friends and family about her whereabouts, particularly when she was working. She would always keep them updated. So the fact that she just stopped texting people was very odd. The following day, November the 15th, Gemma's partner still hadn't seen or heard from his girlfriend, and so he decided to contact the police and report her as missing. So now 2 women in the Ipswich area had been reported missing within the space of just 2 weeks, and as I previously mentioned, both women seemed to be very similar. Both were working in the red light district area to fund their drug addictions, and then one night during work, they just vanished. So the police were really concerned that something serious was going on here, and they really started to fear the worst. And so the investigation into their disappearances really stepped up. They were once again appealing to the public for any information. They were handing out leaflets and posters with the girls' faces on them, and they also began conducting road checks. They were stopping several motorists that were driving around the areas where Tanya and Gemma worked, and they were just asking these motorists if they knew anything about the 2 women. They stopped over 500 cars and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people about this inquiry, but nothing brought the police any closer to finding out what happened to Tanya Nicholl and Gemma Adams. But then on the 2nd of December 2006, one of the girls was found, although sadly not alive. That day, a water bailiff named Trevor Saunders was going along a stream in the area known as Balstead Brook. Trevor was just checking it for water blockages that morning when he spotted something in the stream. He initially thought that this object in the water was a mannequin, and so he decided to get into the water to fetch it, since his job was to clear blockages. But it was then when he realised that it wasn't a mannequin at all. It was actually the dead, naked body of a female. And Trevor immediately thought that this body in the water may have been that of one of the missing women, because their cases had been all over the news. So he contacted the police and reported his discovery, and eventually the body was identified as being 25-year-old Gemma Adams, who had not been seen for a couple of weeks at this point. So the place where Gemma's body was found was cordoned off by the police, and forensics were called to the scene. However, as soon as the forensic officer heard that Gemma's body was in water, he was immediately concerned that they weren't going to find anything in terms of forensic evidence, because the running water would have just washed away any evidence that was originally present on her remains. Gemma's body was pretty decomposed by the time they had found it. I believe she had been lying in that stream since around the time that she went missing, so for a couple of weeks. Like I said, she was found completely naked, although there were no signs on her body that indicated she had been sexually assaulted. But due to the stage of decomposition, the coroner couldn't actually determine a cause of death. They didn't know how she died, but of course, given the circumstances in which she was found, they were certain that foul play was involved, that Gemma Adams had been murdered. After Gemma was discovered, the police continued searching the stream for any other evidence, and despite the fact that it was freezing cold, they sent dive teams into the water to carry on searching through Balstead Brook. And just 6 days later, they discovered another dead body less than 2 miles downstream of where Gemma's body was recovered, and this second body was eventually identified as being 19-year-old Tanya Nicholl, who had disappeared over a month before. Tanya had also been in that water for many weeks, and so unfortunately, again, the chances of the police being able to retrieve any forensic evidence from her body was slim. And just like with Gemma, Tanya's cause of death also could not be determined because of how decomposed her remains were. So now the Suffolk police had a double murder inquiry on their hands, and they continued looking through CCTV footage in the Ipswich area from the evenings that Gemma and Tanya went missing to see if they could spot either of the women that night. They went through 16,000 hours worth of footage, and after looking through some footage from Burlington Road, which was in the red light district area, they found something. They spotted a woman on the footage that they believed was Tanya Nicholl on the evening that she vanished. And on this footage, you can see Tanya getting into a dark coloured car, and then the car drives away. And after this sighting, she is not spotted again. So this footage was the last time she was seen alive. So this bit of footage was kind of like the police's first piece of actual evidence in this case. However, because of how grainy the footage was, they were unable to work out what this car's registration plate was. So it was almost like a dead end already. Due to the fact that they had a lack of evidence in this case, the police began interviewing the sex workers in the area to see if they knew anything or had seen anything on the nights that Tanya and Gemma disappeared. And one of these sex workers that was interviewed by the police was a woman named Paula Clennell, who would eventually suffer the same fate as Tanya and Gemma. Just a couple of days days after the body of Tanya Nicholl was discovered, on the 10th of December 2006, the body of another young woman was found. This killer had struck again. This time the victim was 24-year-old Annalee Alderton, and she had gone missing a week prior on the 3rd of December. Annalee was a mother. She had one child, and it was also found in her autopsy that she was actually pregnant at the time that she was killed. She was 3 months pregnant with her second baby. And just like with the first two women, Annalee was also a sex worker, and she also had an addiction to drugs. Her body was discovered in a woodland near a school in Suffolk. So this victim wasn't actually in water like the first two victims. She was on dry land. Annalee was completely naked when she was found, and it appeared as though the killer had actually positioned her in a certain way before he left the scene. She had been positioned in the shape of a crucifix, so she had her arms stretched out and her legs were together. She looked like a cross. So as soon as Annalee's body was found, forensic teams were sent to the scene, and the police were hopeful that because this body was on land and not in the water like the first two women, that they might actually be able to retrieve some forensic evidence. Unlike with the first two women, this time a cause of death could be determined, and it was found that Annalee's cause of death was asphyxiation from, quote, airway obstruction, so she had likely been strangled to death. So now that they had found Annalee's body, the police began trying to trace her steps from the night that she was last seen, which was the 3rd of December. And they received some information from a witness that said they remembered seeing Annalee getting on a train that evening. So they had a look at the CCTV from that train, and the witness was right. They spotted Annalee on it. She had boarded a train from Harwich, which is a town in Essex, and the train was taking her to Ipswich because she had plans to work in Ipswich's red light district that night. But after this footage of her on the train, she was never seen alive again. So now the police were faced with a third murder. 3 bodies had been found literally within 1 week, and although they couldn't say for definite that all 3 cases were linked, they were pretty certain that they were, and that they had a serial killer on their hands. There was a serial killer on the loose in Ipswich, and this was all huge news. Obviously, the media were reporting on this case constantly, which meant that the town of Ipswich was flooded with journalists and reporters. And as I'm sure you can imagine, people in the area were terrified, especially other sex workers, because they seemed to be the target of this attacker. It was a really difficult situation for these women because they knew of the dangers. They knew that someone was targeting sex workers, and they were told by the police to stay off the streets. But a lot of them ignored these warnings because they had to work, they had to earn money. I'm sure for many of them, this was their only form of income. So a lot of sex workers were still going out to work at the red light district, but they were just trying to be more cautious and careful about which clients they took on. However, in the days after Annalee Alderton's body was found, 2 more women from the Ipswich area were reported as missing, and these were 29-year-old Annette Nichols and 24-year-old Paula Clennell, and they also worked as sex workers. Now, if you remember from earlier on in the video, Paula was one of the sex workers that was, questioned, interviewed by the police about the disappearances of the first 2 women, Tanya and Gemma. And less than a week before she disappeared, Paula Clennell did an interview with a local TV crew about this whole case, about everything that was going on in Ipswich. So I'll show some footage from that interview now.
Why have you decided to come out tonight?
Because I need the money. I need the money,
Despite the dangers?
Well, that has made me a bit wary about getting into cars,
But presumably you will do that tonight?
Well, Probably.
And very soon after Paula was reported as missing, her body was discovered in a wooded area not far from where Annalie Alderton's body was found. So the police rushed straight to the woodland to cordon off this crime scene, and they also called in a helicopter to just get a better view of the entire wooded area from above. They wanted to see if they could spot anything else, any evidence. And the helicopter team did spot something. It was another body. There were 2 bodies in the wooded area, fairly close to each other, and this second body was eventually identified as being the other missing woman, Annette Nicholl. So both Annette and Paula's bodies were taken for an autopsy, and while Annette's cause of death could not be established, it was determined that Paula had died as a result of compression to the neck. She had been strangled to death. So now the victim toll was 5. 5 bodies had been found in just 10 days, and after Annette and Paula's bodies were recovered, the police announced to the public that they believed these 5 murders were all committed by the same person and that they were looking for a serial killer. As I've mentioned a couple of times already, this case was huge news, national news. Everyone was talking about it. There were reporters all over Ipswich, and the News of the World newspaper even offered a £250,000 reward for anyone with information regarding the identity of this killer, who soon became known as the Suffolk Strangler. The police did have a couple of suspects in this case that they were investigating, but there didn't really seem to be much evidence at all linking any of them to the murders. But then there was one man that came into the picture who, in a way, kind of offered himself up to the police. This man was named Tom Stevens. He was 37 years old and he worked in a supermarket, and on the 18th of December he was arrested and taken into custody as he became a suspect in the case of the Suffolk serial killer. Now, the reason why the police felt Tom was a person of interest in this investigation was because he admitted in an interview with a newspaper that he knew all 5 women, all 5 victims. I think he did quite a few interviews with journalists, and in one of them he said the following.
But don't take 3. They'd have trusted me to take this risk. The profile, it does a lot of it looks like me, white man between 25 and 40, knows the area, works like strange hours.
His behaviour just seemed a bit weird. He said that he didn't have any involvement in the case. He said he wasn't the killer, but he also said that he could have been. He could have been the killer because he knew the victims and they trusted him. It was just really odd, and so the police decided to arrest Tom Stevens and take him into custody. But they couldn't charge him with anything at this point because they didn't have any solid evidence linking him to the murders. It was just his behaviour that was suspicious. So the police decided to see if they could find any forensic evidence linking Tom Stevens to the killings. They knew that if they could find his DNA on the bodies of the victims, he had to be the killer. So forensic tests were conducted on the women's bodies, and scientists were actually able to retrieve very small amounts of DNA from the bodies of Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell and Annette Nicholl, which were the last 3 victims that were found in the woodland. And this DNA recovered from 3 of the bodies was found to have come from the same person. So they believed it was the killer's DNA, and they had just enough of it to create a full DNA profile. So they finally had the breakthrough they had been waiting for in this case. They had the killer's DNA. But when this DNA profile was tested against Tom Stevens, the suspect in custody, it was found not to be a match. He was not the Suffolk serial killer. And so Tom was released, and the police put the DNA profile of the killer into the National DNA Database. And from this, a match was found. The match was to a man named Stephen Wright. He was 48 years old at this time in 2006, and he was a local man. He lived on London Road in Ipswich, which is right in the centre of the red light district area. But he wasn't someone that the police suspected at all in this case. He wasn't on the police's radar. He only had one previous criminal conviction, and it was for theft in 2001 when he stole a little bit of money. But other than that, he had never been arrested for anything before, although now he was the main suspect in a serial murder inquiry. But before we go any further with the case, let me just tell you a little bit more about Stephen and his past. So Stephen Wright was born Stephen Gerald James Wright on the 24th of April 1958 to his parents Conrad and Patricia Wright. Stephen was one of 4 siblings. He had 2 younger sisters and an older brother, and the Wright family lived in the country of Norfolk in England. However, when Stephen was around 8-9 years old, his parents Conrad and Patricia actually got a divorce. According to one source I read, Patricia decided to leave Conrad and walk out on the family because he could be very violent towards her, and Stephen himself later claimed that he did grow up in a very violent and abusive household, although his father Conrad denies this, and he says that Stephen actually had a pretty normal childhood. In the year 1974, Stephen left school and he got a job in the Merchant Navy, where he worked as a chef on the ferries. And it was whilst he was working that job that he became known as a bit of a ladies' man. He was always flirting with women, and it was actually pretty rare that he was ever single. He usually always had a girlfriend. And then in 1978, when he was 20 years old, Stephen met a woman named Angela, and they began dating, and they soon got married and had a child together, but they eventually divorced in 1987. Although later that same year, 1987, Stephen Wright married again, this time to a woman named Diane. However, unlike his first marriage, his marriage to Diane did not last long because Stephen was very abusive and violent towards his second wife. And this was no secret either. In fact, their neighbours said that they witnessed Stephen on 3 separate occasions strangling Diane, and they had to literally pull him off of her. So ultimately, due to this horrific abuse, Diane divorced Stephen in 1988, just a year after they married. Now, it seems as though Stephen never really stayed in one job for too long. He was constantly going from job to job. At one point, he worked as a steward on the QE2 cruise ship, then he was a lorry driver. Sometimes he did bar work, and at the time of this case taking place in 2006, he was a forklift driver. And Stephen also had a pretty heavy drinking problem and a gambling problem, which actually caused another long-term relationship of his to break down. In 1989, whilst he was working at a pub, he began dating a woman named Sarah, and they were together for about 4 years and they had a child together. But eventually, like I said, this relationship just broke down. According to a book I read about this case, Stephen also suffered a lot with his mental health, and he tried to kill himself a couple of times, and his brother said that the reason he tried to end his life was because Stephen was actually in a lot of debt. I believe at one point he was in like £40,000 worth of debt, and he just couldn't see a way out of it. But as I mentioned earlier, in the year 2001, he stole around £80 from his place of work in order to pay off some of his debts, although he was caught and he was arrested and charged with theft. And this was when his DNA was entered into the National DNA Database. And then 5 years later, his DNA flagged up a match to the DNA the police now had of the Suffolk serial killer. Stephen Wright's DNA was found on 3 of the victims' bodies. So as soon as the match was made to Stephen Wright, the police put him under 24-hour surveillance. They didn't want to arrest him straight away. I think they just wanted to watch what he did for a little while. And they also wanted to give the forensic team a bit of time to prepare, because as soon as they arrested Stephen, they needed the forensic team to immediately search his home and his car for more evidence. But as soon as the forensic team were ready, the police went to Stephen's home where he lived with his girlfriend Pamela. And in the early hours of the morning on the 19th of December 2006, they arrested him on suspicion of all 5 murders. So the police began questioning Stephen, and they were asking him about his use of sex workers, because they knew from other sex workers in the Ipswich area that he was a regular customer. I believe his girlfriend Pamela worked as a barmaid, or she had another job that meant that she worked nights. She did the night shifts. So as soon as she would go to work, Stephen would head out to the red light district area and he would pick up women. And the sex workers in the area even had a nickname for him because he was such a regular customer. They called him the silver-backed gorilla because of his hair colour. He had silver grey hair. And they also called him the Mondeo Man because of the car he drove. He drove a Ford Mondeo. Anyway, the police were questioning Stephen, but he refused to give anything up, and in his first 8 hours of questioning, he just replied no comment to every single question he was asked. He was not interested in cooperating with the detectives at all, but to be honest, I don't think they really needed him to cooperate. They didn't need a confession out of him because they had his DNA on 3 of the victims' bodies, so they had enough evidence to charge him with the murders. But Stephen denied everything and he decided to plead not guilty, and so the case had to go to trial. The trial was set for January of 2008, and in the meantime, the police knew that they had to keep looking for more evidence that linked Stephen to the crime, because the evidence they currently had didn't necessarily prove that Stephen was the killer. Yes, his DNA was on 3 of the bodies, but you have to remember Stephen did regularly use sex workers, so it would make sense that his DNA was on them. They needed to build a stronger case against him. They needed more evidence, and so they sent a team to forensically search Stephen's car. However, the police knew that it would be difficult to find any forensic evidence in the car because Stephen Wright's neighbours told the police that during the murder spree, they would constantly see him cleaning it. They said that he would obsessively clean that car for hours on end, day and night. He was just always cleaning it, obviously in an attempt to get rid of any evidence. He was very forensically aware. So the forensic team began lifting up and collecting fibres from Stephen's car to see if they could match any of these fibres to fibres that were found on the victims. And they did. They found fibres on Annette Nicholl's body that matched fibres from the footwell of Stephen's car. And they also found tiny flecks of blood in Stephen's car that, when tested, was found to have belonged to Paula Clennell. They also examined a fluorescent jacket that belonged to Stephen, and on that they found even more flecks of blood and this blood was again a match to Paula Clennell and Annette Nicholl's. And also found on a pair of Stephen's gloves were DNA profiles of the 3 victims that were discovered on dry land. So that's Annalee Alderton, Annette Nicholl and Paula Clennell. The police also began re-examining the CCTV footage from the Ipswich area because now they knew what car the killer drove. So they were looking back through this footage from the nights the girls disappeared to see if they could spot the car anywhere. On the night that the second victim, Gemma Adams, disappeared, they spotted Steve Wright's Ford Mondeo car in the area, and they also had another look at the CCTV footage they had of the first victim, Tanya Nicholl, getting into someone's car on the night that she went missing, the footage that I showed earlier. Now that they knew what car Stephen drove, the police had another look at this footage, and they were now certain that the car Tanya got into that night was his. So far in this hunt for evidence, the police had obtained solid DNA forensic evidence linking Stephen to the murders of the last 3 victims, Annalee Alderton, Annette Nicholl and Paula Clennell, the 3 victims that were found on dry land. But so far, all they really had linking Stephen to the first 2 victims, Tanya Nicholl and Gemma Adams, was some CCTV footage, but again, this didn't really prove that he was the one who murdered them. It just proved that he was in the area and that he picked one of the girls up that night. It was still evidence, but the police were worried that if they didn't find any forensic evidence linking him to Tanya and Gemma, that he wouldn't be convicted for their murders. So they had to keep looking. But of course, as I said earlier on in the video, finding any forensic evidence on their bodies was going to be so hard because they were discovered in running water. So chances are any evidence there was present on them would have just washed away. However, scientists began examining everything that was caught in Tanya and Gemma's hair. They had a lot of debris in their hair. I think it was over like 2 kilograms worth of debris, and so forensic teams began really looking through every single fibre and particle in this debris to see if they could find anything. And this took them a long time to do. It literally took them weeks to go through all of this debris and examine all of the fibres and particles. But eventually they found something. They discovered fibres in Gemma Adams' hair, and these fibres were found to have come from Stephen Wright's blue tracksuit bottoms. And they also discovered other fibres in her hair that matched fibres from inside his car and from his sofa in his home. As for Tanya Nicholl, the first victim, they found literally one single black nylon fibre from her hair that matched the carpet in Stephen Wright's Ford Mondeo car. So now they finally had forensic evidence linking Stephen Wright to all 5 of the women, all 5 murders, and on the 14th of January 2008, his trial began. For 15 days, the prosecution presented all of their evidence against him. So they went through all of the CCTV footage and all of the forensic evidence. They had a lot of evidence to go through. And then a couple of weeks into the trial, Stephen Wright himself took the stand to give evidence, during which he claimed that he had sex with the victims on the nights that they disappeared, but that he wasn't the one who actually murdered them. The only woman he said he didn't have sex with was the first victim, Tanya Nicholl. He said that on the night that Tanya disappeared, he did pick her up and she got into his car and he intended on having sex with her, but he said that she was only in his car for a couple of minutes, if that, because he noticed that she had acne on her face and that put him off having sex with her. He was really cruel about Tanya and her appearance in court, to be honest. But yeah, he said that he noticed that Tanya had acne on her face, and so he decided that he didn't want to sleep with her, and so she got out of his car literally a few minutes after she got in. He was basically claiming that all of this was just a big coincidence, that he just happened to sleep with these women on the same nights that they vanished. But of course the jury were not buying it. And on the 21st of February 2008, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury had decided on a verdict. They found 49-year-old Stephen Wright guilty of all 5 murders. The murders of Tanya Nicholl, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Annette Nichols and Paula Clennell. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the judge recommending that he should never be released. And so, of course, that is where he still remains today, in prison. Stephen Wright is currently around 62 years old, and it has been suggested over the years that maybe he had more victims than those 5. Maybe he was responsible for even more murders. However, he has never successfully been linked to other cases, so whether he did have more victims or not, we may never know now. But yeah, that is it for this case. That is the case of Stephen Wright, the Ipswich serial killer. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. Before I go, I do just want to say a huge thank you to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. I also just want to thank Small Town Murders once again for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can download the game by clicking the link in the description box of this video. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys!